Hello again, fellow Mystery Files. Today I am reviewing Ngaio Marsh's classic mystery novel, The Nursing Home Murder, starring her gentleman sleuth, Roderick Alleyn. The Nursing Home Murder celebrates its 90th anniversary in 2025, and to me, this is the best of the first five. The first five being, the first five Roderick Alleyn novels that tend to be a little rough. I always recommend starting Roderick Alleyn with Artist in Crime, Book 6. And while you are missing out on some fun stuff like Single Allen and Nigel shenanigans, these first five are really just not Marsh's best work. But The Nursing Home Murder, I think, is clearly the strongest of these five. I don't think it's particularly close either. And this is probably one of the more well known Marsh novels. Ngaio Marsh does not have any true, universally well known, iconic book titles, despite how well known and popular she remains. It's one of the few that's been adapted. It was adapted for the Allen series starring Patrick Malahide and also turned into a play by Marsh herself called Exit Sir Derek. And, the play never was actually produced, though apparently it was a lot of fun. It wasn't produced because it was too similar to another play, so Marsh just pulled it, which is a shame. That other play is really forgotten. So, anyway, this one could have been an all time great hit, but Marsh's plays never flopped, so her pulling her own was probably a sign that maybe she thought it would flop. I don't know. But, The Nursing Home Murder also gets a shout out by Agatha Christie in Murder in Mesopotamia. Amy Leatherhead is reading this book over the course of her journey, and she talks about how she thinks the redheaded parlor maid did it, which, is Christie not spoiling her friend's book. There is no parlor maid in this book. And, Nursing Home Murder is also the book that really made Ngaio Marsh famous. I mean, this is where her writing career took off. So, as always, I will provide a spoiler free summary with commentary up until the point of the murderer reveal, at which time I will let you know it's coming so you can back out if you need be. From that point forward, spoilers are fair game. And before I begin, make sure you like and subscribe to keep up to date with the channel. The nursing home murder begins in a cabinet meeting at 10 Downing Street. The Prime Minister is there with his entire cabinet. The Prime Minister is not named, and neither is anyone else because this is a fictional cabinet. Marsh is somewhat vague politically here, with all different sides taking hits. I mean, she refers to the cabinet as a group of men so professional they lack the natural ability to be human, which is a really great description. The exception here is the Home Secretary, Sir Derek O'Callaghan. And, in the U.S., we would call the Home Secretary the Secretary of Homeland Security. That's the rough equivalent. The cabinet is discussing a bill to deal with violent anarchists in Britain, with the understanding that whoever introduces this bill will be the target of these anarchists. One, Inspector Roderick Alleyn is not at the cabinet meeting, but he has previously warned the Prime Minister about these anarchists. And Sir Derek feels it's his obligation to introduce this bill because he's the Home Secretary, and he also doesn't really care about the threats. We sort of get the impression Sir Derek is a bit depressed here, or maybe suicidal even. He's suffering from abdominal pain, which he assumes is his appendix, but he won't get it treated for until the bill passes. And privately, he admits to himself that he doesn't really care about the bill or the threats. He is getting threats from violent anarchists, but he doesn't really take them seriously. But he's also getting death threats from his mistress, Jane Harden. They had a fling in which Jane wants nothing to do with Sir Derek anymore and accuses Sir Derek of manipulating her and then threatens to kill him if he approaches her again. Sir Derek has a wife, Cicely, who worries about him, but she doesn't push the stomach issue. Who does push the stomach issue is Sir Derek's sister, Ruth, who, a bit of a kook here. Sir Derek describes her as mentally insane. To me, she comes across as more of your just standard weirdo. She pushes him to take all kinds of weird medicines she gets from her pharmacist friend, especially one called Fulvita Volts. Beautiful name there, and more on them later. Sir John Phillips pays Sir Derek a visit. Sir John is Sir Derek's best friend and personal physician. Or I should say, was Sir Derek's best friend and personal physician, because Sir John Phillips wants to marry Jane Harden, who is a nurse at this hospital. But Jane will not marry Sir John because she's so upset over the way Sir Derek treated her, and since the two are friends, it's all very awkward for her. Sir Derek and Sir John get into a huge blow up. Sir John threatens Sir Derek's life and tells him they are no longer friends. This causes Sir Derek to collapse in pain, and he winds up taking a Fulvitavol packet, which he normally does not take the medicine his sister brings to him. The next day, Sir Derek returns to Parliament, where he once again collapses, and this time is rushed to the hospital. Because Sir Derek didn't tell anyone about his falling out with his friend Sir John, he's rushed to Sir John's hospital or nursing home. A nursing home in this context of the novel is a small private hospital. It is not an old folks' home, which is what I thought it was the first time I read this book. That's an American phrase. Lady O'Callaghan insists Sir John perform the surgery. Sir Derek has peritonitis and needs surgery here. And while the anteroom is being prepped for this surgery, Sir Derek is very weak. And he tries to tell his wife that he doesn't want Sir John to do the surgery, but he can't get the words out. The reader knows what he means, but no one else does. And Ruth swings by with some more random medications from her chemist friend, and she insists her brother takes them, but Cicely pushes her out of the way. Meanwhile, the surgical team just openly talks about murdering Sir Derek during the surgery. Sir John mentions it. Jane Harden mentions it. Nurse Banks mentions it. Nurse Banks is a militant communist, so she has no love for anyone like Sir Derek. She's a comedic figure. At one point, she's railing against work, to which someone asked her, well, then why do you have a job then? Dr. Toms, he's assisting Sir John with the surgery, talks about this play he saw about how this doctor had to decide whether or not to murder his patient on the operating table. The two had been friends, though they had a recent falling out, just completely unaware of this is what Sir John's situation is. And the other members of the surgical team are Dr. Roberts, not the same Dr. Roberts from Cards on the Table. He's an anesthesiologist, and Sister Marigold, who's the very strict matron of the hospital. During the prep, we learn Sir John likes to prepare his own hyoscine solution instead of using the pre-made standard solution. This book does not get very technical with the medical terms, but I'll try to simplify it even further. We're told hyoscine is used because it lessens the amount of anesthesia needed and makes recovery easier. I looked this up, and what I understand hyoscine does is it calms the stomach muscles to make the surgery in that area easier. And it's apparently still used today. I think it's safe to assume Ngaio Marsh received a hyoscine injection when she had surgery. The inspiration for this book came to Marsh while she was in the hospital recovering from a series of gynecological surgeries after she was diagnosed with cancer. A very small amount of hyoscine is the recommended dose, about 1/100th of a grain, with a quarter grain being certainly fatal. Sister Marigold is domineering, and she gets angry with Sir John because Sir John prefers to make his own solution, and she doesn't understand why he doesn't trust the standard hospital supply that all the other doctors use. Sir Derek is wheeled into surgery, and he mumbles something like, don't, which is one of the more credible examples of cryptic last words. Dr. Roberts administers the anesthesia and notices immediately Sir Derek's pulse is weak. So Nurse Banks administers a shot of camphor to help. Sir John opens the stomach, and we are spared the graphic details of what this looks like, other than it's really, really bad and really gross. Roberts continues to comment about the weak pulse, and everyone else just ignores him. Sir John is totally spaced out, and we're told his hands tremble, which is very unusual for him. Jane is on a completely different planet. I think Ngaio Marsh does an excellent job of describing the surgery without getting too detailed or too gory. She describes how there's a privacy curtain shield separating Sir Derek's torso from the stomach, so the operators can't really tell who it is, and that helps them because, especially here where they talk about openly murdering the patient. She's very much playing fair here because this setup will be important to solving the mystery. And the surgery is a success. And when Sir John sews Sir Derek up, he asks Jane for a serum of anti-gas. And Jane hesitates here. She has to be told the serum is in the large syringe, and she just completely spaces out and faints. But Sir Derek is still alive when he leaves the operating theater. Nurse Banks takes a moment to make fun of Jane for fainting and then gossips about her and Sir Derek. The men once again bring up the fact that they could have just murdered the Home Secretary, but they didn't. And Dr. Roberts has this ancient stethoscope with notches in it, and they joke about how those represent how many patients he's killed. Roberts laughs along with this, but he's pretty ticked off at this joke, and he says they represent patients he's pulled through difficult surgeries. And Roberts is still worried about Sir Derek's pulse. They didn't do anything about it and never really recovered. So Sir John goes to check in on the patient in recovery, and Sir Derek is dead. And Nurse Banks is very giddy about this. This death, however, is believed to be a natural death. It was well known Sir Derek waited just way too long to get treatment. Lady O'Callaghan, however, thinks he must have been poisoned. She found those threatening letters from Jane and from Sir John and from the anarchists and is convinced her husband was murdered. She consults her husband's secretary, Mr. Ronald Jameson, and, he won't speak his mind in front of his employer's wife, but he doesn't think anything was suspicious. And Lady O'Callaghan is more concerned about those personal letters from Jane and John. She did not realize to the extent her husband's relationship with Jane was, or that he had a falling out with Sir John. She calls in Scotland Yard, and Inspector Fox arrives and tells her basically they can't do anything about this because their death certificate was signed, and once that happens, it's very hard to get that questioned. And this is especially true here because it's Dr. Toms who signed the death certificate, not Sir John. If it was Sir John, she might have a case because she suspects Sir John, but it was Dr. Toms who signed the death certificate. And I should also say during all of this, Sir Derek's body is in the house. I mean, this was a very sort of common custom to wake the dead out in their house. We don't see a lot of funeral rituals in mystery novels, but this isn't the only time we'll see a dead man waked out in his house in a Ngaio Marsh novel. And it happens again in Surfeit of Lampreys with rather disturbing results. Lady O'Callaghan appeals to Inspector Alleyn, and he tells her basically the same thing Inspector Fox told her, but he says, well, he'll look into it because she's ready to make a big fuss about this, and that could be really disastrous. Alleyn also thinks that if Sir Derek was murdered, he had to have been poisoned, and likely someone with a personal grudge. He's been investigating those anarchists, and while they did send him threatening letters, Alleyn knows they've mostly been harmless, and even if they weren't, they would have, blown Sir Derek up with a bomb or, shot him in public. They would not have committed a murder of him in this way. An inquest does happen, and we don't see the inquest, but Alleyn and Fox talk about it, and there were two main points of discussion. One is Jane Harden's hesitation when she went to retrieve the big needle with the anti-gas, and the other is Nurse Banks, because everyone who was in the operating theater just really clams up when they're asked about her, and we know, and so does Alleyn, that Nurse Banks is a communist and openly cheered for Sir Derek's death, but no one wants to mention that for fear of ruining the hospital's reputation. Sir John is angry his judgment is being challenged, and while all the others want an autopsy to prove nothing was wrong with the surgery, but in the end, an autopsy is ordered and it comes back by poison, specifically hyoscine, by person or persons unknown. Alleyn goes to the nursing home to investigate, and he's interested in how the hyoscine may have gone into Sir Derek's body because his body only has 3 injection sites, all of which are accounted for. Sir Derek demonstrates how he made the hyoscine solution, and even if he somehow accidentally or intentionally used all of the hyoscine he had, it's still not enough to account for the incredibly large amount of hyoscine in Sir Derek's body. It's difficult to keep track of all this because, the hospital supply of hyoscine, they've used it since. It's been 2 weeks since Sir Derek died, and there's been other surgeries where it was used. And Alleyn learns that Nurse Banks has been fired because she openly cheered for the death of Sir Derek, but she insists she didn't murder him, nor does she think anyone else did, because everyone at the hospital is just so professional and so indebted to their oaths to murder a patient. I mean, she says this was a bad thing. But anyway, Jane Harden cannot provide any real explanation for her hesitation, but just insists she grabbed the right syringe, which was already prepared by Nurse Banks. This instance reminded me of the first Knives Out movie. I'll say no more about that, or perhaps Knives Out was inspired by this. The most interesting new information comes from a Nurse Graham who attended to Sir Derek before the operation. She found a piece of a wrapper on the floor of his room and the water glass was empty. Since Ruth was the last person in there, Alan assumes that Ruth must have given her brother one of her patent medicines. Ruth previously told Alan her brother never took a Fulvita Volt, which the reader knows is not true, and now it appears he took at least two. So, what Alan is clearly thinking is that the hyoscine got into Sir Derek from like a little bit here, a little bit there. Dr. Toms tells Alan there can't be a lot of hyoscine in the Fulvita Volts, and the injections to account for the amount that killed him. Specifically, we're told it was a quarter of a grain of hyoscine, which doesn't sound like a lot to me, but apparently it is. I'm not a doctor, I don't know. Dr. Toms is very open to an investigation, more so than anyone else. And he shows Alan just like where everyone was positioned during the surgery. A diagram of this would have been very helpful, but Marsh gives us nothing but written description, so we have to visualize this ourselves. Dr. Roberts and Nurse Banks were positioned at Sir Derek's head, dealing with like the anesthesia and monitoring his vital signs, while everyone else was by the abdomen, although some people like did move around, to fetch different items. Alan pays a visit to Dr. Roberts, and Dr. Roberts is not the usual anesthetist at the nursing home. He's the substitute. Alan asks him why he didn't administer the camphor injection because that would traditionally be the job of the anesthesiologist. Yet he asked Nurse Banks to do it, and Roberts explains that he never administers injections anymore because he once accidentally killed a patient with an overdose of morphine. Dr. Roberts is a big fan of eugenics and studies what he calls quote, hereditary taints, unquote, meaning occurrences of mental defects in a family. Ngaio Marsh never once takes his side. The talk does get icky at times, but Marsh is very clear to repudiate eugenics in this novel. But Dr. Roberts talks about how Sir Derek's father had suicidal tendencies and how his sister is a lunatic, and that Sir Derek probably committed suicide, which just seems really ridiculous. Like, when would he have done that? But then he then proceeds to question Alan for any mental defects in his bloodline, to which Alan proceeds to have some very much fun with that. And I've always found this scene and another similar scene later on in the novel to be fascinating. I mean, Dr. Roberts just spews pretty ignorant and very stupid ideas, yet Alan describes him as having this charm and magnetism about him in a way that draws you in. And Alan later admits that he doesn't want to spend a lot of time around Dr. Roberts because he's just so compelling. And he started to actually contemplate some of these eugenic ideas that Alan knew were stupid and knew were wrong. I mean, chronologically, this is the first time we see this sort of character in a Ngaio Marsh novel, this smooth talker who spouts like very clear nonsense, but has like a way about him that sucks people in. Marsh is always warning us about these people and the power of influence they have over others. And she's always telling us they influence intelligent people like Inspector Alleyn, who have a natural curiosity and a desire to learn new things. But Alan escapes all of this with his faculties in check, thank goodness. He then seeks out his old friend Nigel Bathgate and his fiancée Angela North, returning from A Man Lay Dead. He wants their opinion on the case, and while Inspector Fox does appear in this novel, he isn't quite Alan's right-hand man just yet. That honor is still with Nigel, and Nigel and Angela get into a little tiff over whether or not they can guess the murderer. Nigel puts his money on Dr. Roberts, so naturally Angela bets on anyone but Dr. Roberts. Alan invites Nigel and Angela to the Palladium to see a play, and this is the same play Dr. Toms and Sir John were discussing about that operation. Dr. Toms would not discuss it with Alan, and he learns why pretty quickly when the play turns out to have a lot of just eerie coincidences with what happened to Sir Derek. He then takes Nigel and Angela to an underground communist meeting. Alan says this meeting is exclusive, and he finds that ironic because communists are supposed to support everyone for the greater good, so naturally this meeting should be open to everyone. And this is by far the best scene in the novel from a character standpoint. It's just delightful. I mean, they come up with these fake names and disguises to infiltrate the meeting. Specifically, Alan wants Nigel and Angela to pick Nurse Banks's mind because he knows she's going to be there. Meanwhile, Alan is going to check on Harold Sage, who is the chemist, what we would call in the U.S. a pharmacist, who is friends with Ruth O'Callahan, and he is the creator of Fulvita Volts. The meeting is led by Nicholas Kakarov, and it gets underway pretty quickly. And Kakarov is another one of those like ridiculous figures who has the power of like sucking in everyone's attention, just like Dr. Roberts. Although we're told Kakarov appeals to the ignorant more so than the intelligent. And everyone except for Alan, Nigel, and Angela are just like completely absorbed by what Kakarov is saying, which is ridiculous. We actually do see some of what he says, and he speaks mostly in like communist buzzwords. It's ridiculous. And Angela nearly blows their cover by laughing hysterically. Like she cannot help herself. But everyone else is just eating up Kakarov's words. And Alan comes away from the meeting feeling pretty convinced the communism angle isn't a factor. I mean, for one, Kakarov, while cheering for Sir Derek's death, expressed disappointment that it wasn't a more like dramatic public murder. Inspector Fox was also undercover, and he noticed Dr. Roberts was in attendance. And this is odd because Dr. Roberts is a right-wing lunatic, and these communists are left-wing lunatics. But most of the new information learned here comes from Harold Sage, who fell out of his chair in shock when Nigel brought up Ruth O'Callahan. Harold claimed like he doesn't really know Ruth and he never spoke to her about her brother. He kind of flops around a bit like a fish out of water. Alan the next day pays him a visit, and he lies once again about knowing Ruth and won't say what's in the Fulvita vaults. He claims to actually not even know, which is ridiculous, but he also fumbles when Alan asks him about prescriptions he made up for Ruth. And while all of this makes Harold Sage more suspicious, Alan thinks it clears him because Harold Sage is just like such a clumsy loser. Like he could never murder Sir Derek. Like he just wouldn't be able to pull it off. Sir John wants to speak with Alan and confesses that you know what? Maybe he did make a mistake when filling that syringe with hyoscine. He can't really remember, and maybe he was in such a state that he wasn't paying attention to what he was doing. Alan doesn't buy any of this because he recognizes Sir John is just trying to cover for Jane, or at least wishes to spare Jane any further unpleasantness. And even if Sir John used the whole tube of hyoscine, it's still not anywhere near enough to meet the high amount that was in Sir Derek's body. Alan decides then he needs to see what really happened in the operating theater, so he wants to reenact the situation. And this is something Alan does a lot in these early novels where he like reenacts the crime scene. It tends to get tedious, although I did not find it such here. And all of this requires getting like Nurse Banks back and Dr. Roberts back. Alan once again visits Dr. Roberts, who doesn't want to participate in any of this. All he wants to do is talk about mentally ill people and how they should be sterilized. But he does eventually agree to go. And he also repeatedly asked Alan if Sir Derek committed suicide, which again, it's just ridiculous. But he's been pushing this theory like the whole novel. And he has to drag like his heavy anesthesia cart with him to the hospital, which he doesn't want to do. But Alan is able to get everyone assembled. And this is where I end the spoiler-free section, so back out now if you don't want to be spoiled. You've been warned. Alan and Fox assemble everyone at the hospital, including Lady O'Callahan and Ruth O'Callahan. He wants to see what everyone was doing during the surgery, including before. And this is something Alan does a lot, and again, it's usually not that interesting, but I did find it was pretty good here. There was not a lot of repeating the same thing again and again and again. And Alan gets Ruth to mention that she forced her brother to take a Fulvita Volt before the surgery. And when he died, she realized that her medicine might have been poison. She kept the rest of the Fulvita Volts to commit suicide should she have been arrested. And it's pretty clear that at least she thinks Harold Sage botched the medication. Perhaps he did so intentionally, but she's very defensive of him. Back in the operating theater, things don't go smoothly at all. Dr. Toms, in particular, has like a really hard time trying to remember what he did when and like what he said, and constantly has to be reminded. Jane doesn't want to participate at all. Things come to a head when they reenact the actual surgery. Sister Marigold, who we haven't heard from in a while, faints when she sees the operating table. We never get an explanation as to why the stoic and professional Sister Marigold faints, but again, I think we can safely assume that she realized what happened when she saw the table. Again, there's no patient on the table, but they use a dummy, and that includes putting up the privacy screen across the abdominal area. in effect separating the upper half of the body from the lower half. You cannot see through the screen, and we were told about this at the beginning of the novel. It's not something withheld from us. But Sister Marigold faints and nearly knocks over the anesthesia cart. Dr. Toms freaks out and claims that she could have blown up the entire hospital, but Dr. Roberts tells him, don't be ridiculous, it's not going to explode. That wouldn't happen because the cart is very sturdy and all the bolts are in place. The hospital is not going to blow up. And then Alan realizes that Dr. Roberts is very protective of that anesthesia cart, more so than you would normally be. He never lets anyone go near it, including Nurse Banks, who was assisting him with the anesthesia during the surgery. But the reenactment continues on. Dr. Roberts brings up the low pulse. Nurse Banks pretends to get the camphor shot. Jane goes to get the anti-gas needle, and then they sew the dummy back up. And that's it. Alan knows who the murderer is, and he waits to make the arrest until he secures the warrant. And our murderer is Dr. Roberts, our eugenics-loving anesthesiologist. So what happened was Sir Derek's father had some mental health issues, including when he committed suicide. And being a eugenicist, Dr. Roberts took it upon himself to rid the world of these people whom he claimed were mentally defective. And when Sir Derek showed up on the operating table, Dr. Roberts seized the chance. I think the weakest part of the book here is that we don't get any actual details on how Dr. Roberts did this. We have to assume a lot of things happened. We do know that one of the bolts on his anesthesia cart is actually a secret hiding place where he keeps a syringe full of hyoscine for quote unquote emergencies. And when he administered this shot is unknown, but it probably had to be when Nurse Banks left to get the camphor shot, because that curtain screen divided the top half. Sir Derek was from the bottom half. Dr. Roberts basically had free reign of the top half when Nurse Banks was momentarily away. We don't get confirmation of that, and I'll get into this in the criticism section, but there is a reason to believe maybe he couldn't have done it then. And remember that stethoscope with the notches? Yeah, those notches are in fact confirmed kills. Those are not people he helped. Those are people he murdered on the operating table because they were mentally deficient in his mind. In a bit of irony, Alan speculates that the true insane person this whole time was Dr. Roberts himself, with his mania of ridding the world of certain people whom he deems worthy of death. Again, not at all cozy here. And the final thing I want to bring up here is that some weird bit of perhaps personal information from Ngaio Marsh here, but one of the things Dr. Roberts has been pushing this whole time is the sterilization bill. That this idea that people who are mentally ill should be sterilized so they don't reproduce. And it's interesting she uses this plot point because those surgeries she had that inspired this novel left Ngaio Marsh sterile. She had gynecological issues. It's not clear exactly what she had. She had some kind of cancer. It's not exactly known, but she had a series of surgeries, and it left her unable to have children. And, obviously Ngaio Marsh never had children, and she never married either. But it's just interesting that this was on her mind so close after something so personal happened to her. So it is interesting. Obviously, she depicts it as bad, and again, it is really bad. Thank God she didn't say this was a good idea. There are definitely authors writing at this time who would entertain the idea. But that is the end of the nursing home murder summary section here. And let's get into praise. I have a lot for this book. This is definitely a book that is more enjoyable than good in quality. I rank The Nursing Home Murder number 18 of 33 Allen novels, which is just below the halfway point, and I don't think I move it up after this reread. My opinion of it went up for sure, but I don't think I could justify putting it above any of the titles currently above it. The murder plot of this book is very fun. It's very typical of the Golden Age, Alan tracking down all the poisons and Fox doing his thing. It feels very typical of the time. It's a very clever plot. It's not necessarily unique, but then again, this book probably is one of the first hospital set murder mysteries, or at least the one that sets the basis for future books of its kind. I think the hospital setting is very good and very well depicted. We know Marsh consulted her doctors to get the medical info just right, and I think she does a very good job of presenting that information without overdoing it and making it really boring. I think this easily could have been a slog. And in general, I think Marsh gives very good descriptions in this book. I already mentioned how she described the cabinet members as so professional they didn't know how to be human, which is a good line. This book is littered with that sort of thing. And I think Marsh does a good job remaining politically neutral here. Oftentimes I find authors who write politically charged novels and try to be neutral and distant fail because it seems like they're trying not to play any side, and you wind up like saying nothing at all and just like, or outright just failing to be neutral. Here Marsh is super vague and yet is slapping all the sides. Like, she's critical of the left wing, of the right wing, and also the people in charge, the status quo. Like, she's having a field day calling everyone out on their failures and like their zaniness, while also making the point that the people in power, even if they are the center, even if they are the most stable ones, aren't really that great either. I mean, she offers no solution because that's not what this novel is about. But this book is a very easy read compared to her first two novels. I mean, she learned from experience. There isn't a lot of repetition. There isn't a late book murder just to sprinkle in more excitement because the original plot isn't strong enough. This is a marked improvement in the nursing home murder compared to A Man Lay Dead, which was ridiculous and had a very thin plot, and Enter a Murderer, which is highly flawed. And I thought the communism and the anarchism, as she uses both words interchangeably, which is very common, they're not really the same thing. But I thought they were used very well in this book. And normally I would just like roll my eyes at a mention of communism, but I thought Marsh used it very well here. I think this book's strongest selling point outside of sort of like the classic murder plot is its humor. This book is very funny. I mean, the scene where Alan and Nigel and Angela go to the underground meeting, it's just so much fun. And it continues on when we learn like Fox was there undercover and he has to like put in his dentures. It's so much fun. And like also we have like a lot of people just like openly musing about murdering Sir Derek, and it's all meant to be very humorous. It's not like a dark humor either. It's just so much fun. And in general, there's like an air of sarcasm sort of like lingering over this novel and the way Marsh describes certain characters. I mean, Ruth O'Callahan is a fantastic character. Harold Sage doesn't get a lot of page time, but he was a lot of fun. Even those like lesser characters like Nash the butler was pretty good. The way the doctors and nurses muse about Sir Derek is just so funny. And the characters are largely good. I mean, some of them, not so much as others, but again, no one was a complete flop here. Overall, this was a very strong novel, and one I think starts Ngaio Marsh on this upward trajectory that would take off by the time of like Artists in Crime. That's certainly what happened in real life. Like, this was the book that launched her onto the, put her in the same contention as like a Christie or a Sayers. And now for some criticism. And this book is an early Ngaio Marsh, so it does have all the flaws I associate with those, which is why I couldn't move it above number 18. I don't think this book belongs in the top half of the canon. The main thing here to talk about is the eugenics discussion. Marsh, again, very careful to reject the idea of eugenics and anyone associated with it. She makes the point of how these like smooth talkers are dangerous because, they suck you in, and even Alan almost falls for it. And it's good she does that, but still, just like the overall language used here is uncomfortable and icky. And again, it's just not like the most exciting things to read about. And just I think intentionally she makes her point again and again that she's not siding with Dr. Roberts or like Kakarov or these other people, but it's just like it's not like pleasant to read. And it's not particularly great to me that the talk of it sort of like lingers around, and I think much longer than it really has to. And she also takes a bit to like get to her point that it's bad. Like, she does let Roberts talk a while before she starts giving the commentary that this is not good. And the way Marsh writes Ruth O'Callahan is a bit icky at points, and we do have other people talk about Ruth negatively and call her a lunatic in the literal sense. I mean, to me, Ruth comes across as just sort of like an eccentric, sort of like wacko, and not someone with like mental health issues. I think a good comparison to her would be Cora Lansquenet from After the Funeral, who's this like eccentric sister character who's like into just like really odd things and makes everyone uncomfortable, and they try to avoid her. Again, March is not taking this argument's side, but the presence of it can be uncomfortable if you're adverse to that sort of talk. Marsh also talks about suicide being an inherited trait, which is not great. And the final issue on this point is that we're led to believe Dr. Roberts, who hates communists, goes to the communist meeting to push his sterilization bill. That's not really how I interpret this. I interpret it as he goes to the meeting to find new victims, which again, Marsh isn't saying communists are mentally defective. That's the term written in the book. But it's not great. She's putting the idea out there that someone's political views are tied to like a mental deficiency. Moving on to other things, I think the plot works. There are plot holes here and there. It's nothing like that really like causes the plot to collapse, but like we don't get an exact plan on how Dr. Roberts murdered Sir Derek. We know that he had to have happened at some point, but Dr. Roberts had to inject Sir Derek when Nurse Banks left to get the camphor injection because this is the only time he was alone on that side of the privacy screen. However, that doesn't really work. We know there were three injection sites on Sir Derek's body, all of which were accounted for. This means that Dr. Roberts had to inject the hyoscine into an already used injection site, but Nurse Banks hadn't given him the camphor yet, which is the injection he would have had to reuse. And Nurse Banks is unlikely to have injected the camphor into an existing injection site just by chance. So I suppose it's possible Dr. Roberts injected the hyoscine before the surgery when he was giving the anesthesia. There is some evidence for this, as we were told the surgery goes very well, despite how bad the stomach was, and hyoscine relaxes the stomach and makes the surgery easier. But that doesn't solve the injection site issue. And Marsh never gets technical when talking about medical aspects here, but I mean, she does talk a lot about like the different ways hyoscine may have been consumed, and it gets a little confusing to follow. And sometimes she does get a little specific about like how to make hyoscine that isn't the most interesting. I mean, Sister Marigold fainting during the reenactment is out of character for her, and we're not given a plausible explanation for that. It's not a big deal, but it's a little odd. And this book never gets boring, but I do think Marsh has just simply more engaging plots out there. And in like the wide view of all her novels, I don't think this one stands out to me personally. The plot is fine. Like I don't hate it. I think it's perfectly fine. But Marsh's writing is fine. But I do think it could be polished up a bit. It needs refinement to be truly spectacular. Again, this is an early Marsh. It has all of those pitfalls of being a novel from a time before its author became an expert, and it does show. It shows less here than in the other five, but it's still there. Let's move on to the characters, starting off with our lead in Roderick Alleyn, who was a lot of fun here. I think Alleyn is really starting to come into his own character in this novel. And in Man Lay Dead, he barely appears and has like no personality. And Enter a Murderer, he's largely attached to Nigel. Here he functions much more independently. Lots of great character moments and one liners from him. We do start seeing his budding friendship with Inspector Fox and his continued friendship with Nigel and Angela, which won't last much longer as they do get pushed out for Fox in a few books. But this is really the first time we see Alleyn form good and logical deductions. His first two appearances were wonky in terms of just like the mechanics of those novels, and he just sort of like stumbles into the right solution, but here he does do the work. He does make the deductions. I found his handling of like the cabinet members interesting. Although we never see him interact with them, we do know the cabinet members treat Alleyn as a godlike figure and listen to what he says. Like he definitely could dictate the goings on of the cabinet if he wanted to. And the way he deals with the likes of like Ruth O'Callahan and Sir John are almost like Miss Marple. Like he's so gentle yet forceful that you don't even realize that he had you under his control the whole time. Alleyn learns everything he needs to, whether the characters reveal that to him or not. He gleans it from actions and words. And he does get forceful when he needs to. I think an underrated part of Alleyn's personality, not just in this book, but across the series, is his ability to tailor his approach for each individual suspect. And that is on display here. Like, he treats everyone a little differently. Like, he knows exactly what works on each different person. So I think this was a very good novel for Alleyn content. Then we have Nigel and Angela, who I'll talk about together here. Nigel is still Alan's main sidekick, and we also saw a lot of him, and he was a lot of fun. His relationship with Angela was also fun. They had great banter, pretending to be communists at the meeting. Again, the scene is just pure fun from character moments. It's delightful, and they have this over the top way of speaking to each other, and they're kind of bad at the undercover work. They almost give up the whole game by laughing at everything that's being said, and just like being ill prepared to do this. But I mean, they have good chemistry with each other and with Alan. Like Angela makes Alan blush by talking about how handsome he is all the time. Again, there's where Alan is single here, so there's a lot of talk about handsome Alan here, and they don't really serve a lot of like plot purpose, but they were a lot of fun. It is interesting to me still that at the end of the novel, Alan explains everything. His summation gathering is he gives it to Nigel and Angela, not Inspector Fox just yet. Again, that will happen later on, but still, Nigel and Angela are still number one to Alan at this point. And we have Inspector Fox in his first true appearance here. He does not appear in A Man Lay Dead and was sort of like generic and Enter a Murderer. And this is the first time he has like something to do. I think it was hilarious when we learned like that big guy at the communist meeting was just Fox in disguise without his dentures in. This is also the first time it gets mentioned that Fox is trying to learn French, which becomes like a recurring joke throughout the series that I love. And we do see a little bit of Fox on his own here. He visits Lady O'Callahan when she tells him she thinks her husband was murdered. We don't quite see it yet, but it's alluded to that Fox is much better at handling the ladies downstairs, meaning the servants, than the people upstairs. Fox is very blue collar, and he does handle Lady O'Callahan professionally, but she does get the better of him. But I always loved Fox, and he still has a bit to go before he becomes Alan's main sidekick, but we do see that budding friendship here. It is on the horizon, but is not fully developed just quite yet. And we have our murderer in Dr. Roberts, not the only murderer of that name in a Golden Age mystery. This one precedes the other one, by the way, by about a year. And Dr. Roberts is a great character, and I watched just such good work with him. In particular, the way he's introduced. I haven't really talked about this on the channel too much, or really at all, but the way characters are introduced is important in literature, not just in mystery novels. Each character of some substance should have a proper introduction, and Dr. Roberts' introduction is very good. We first see him in the operating room, where Marsh describes him as a deprecating looking individual, and his first line of dialogue is, quote, "I'm delighted to come," unquote, which at first glance sounds extremely generic and not at all a good line of first dialogue. A character's first line of dialogue should say something about them. It shouldn't be like hello or how are you or something like that. But that quote takes a very sinister tone. Why is he delighted to be there? Oh, because he gets to kill Sir Derek. Marsh introduces Dr. Roberts as almost a joke character, and then he's the one during the surgery who's constantly warning the others that Sir Derek's pulse is failing and something's wrong, and Marsh really sets him up as this good-hearted person, which is ideal. I mean, not only for a murderer, so she can trick you later on, but very apt for this, like, kind of smooth-talking character. He sucks you in. He doesn't start blabbing on about eugenics until much later on when you've already formed a positive opinion about him. And this character is based on a real person Marsh knew in New Zealand, who was this smooth-talking priest, priest in air quotes, who manipulated people for his own gain. And much more prominently, she would use this person in her very next book, Death and Ecstasy. Marsh's father actually drove the priest out of town with an angry mob. Roberts is such an effective character and murderer. I loved how he had that stethoscope with the notches in it. It fits his personality very well. Now, I do think the stethoscope is a little bit of an obvious Chekhov's gun, a Chekhov's gun being that thing that gets mentioned early on, then ignored, but it has to play some kind of role because it was there. It did feel a little obvious, and I do remember my first read-through of this book many years ago, and that being the very thing that pointed me in his direction. And our victim is Sir Derek O'Callahan, the Home Secretary, whom we do meet for like a chapter or two. I thought he was a very effective character. I think Marsh depicts him beautifully as this politician who, yeah, he's dedicated to his country, but he isn't so like jingoistic as to go full throttle against, the anarchist. He's not, the murder victim from Dyed in the Wool, who's very jingoistic. I wouldn't say he's suicidal necessarily, but there is this sense that, like, he wouldn't really care if he died. He's sort of just tired of dealing with Jane Harden and the anarchists and like being a politician, and he doesn't really care about his health either. I mean, at one point he thinks something like, "Oh, this ridiculous bill is because the anarchists don't pose any significant threat to the public safety, and like why is he putting his life at risk for this?" And like, again, we don't know a lot about his relationship with his wife. I mean, presumably he was never going to leave her for Jane. I do like the opening chapter where Sir Derek is just pummeled by problem after problem, and he just like doesn't care because he's in so much pain, and he doesn't really care much, you know, to begin with, and then he just collapses. It's almost a relief for him, like that he just collapses. Now, I think we can assume he wasn't suicidal. I know Dr. Roberts was pushing that, and while that makes sense from like a character standpoint, practically, I mean, Sir Derek couldn't have killed himself. I mean, he was basically, you know, unconscious. Not totally unconscious, but I mean, he did not have the physical capability to inject himself with a needle. But alas, he's afraid of Sir John doing the surgery, and I think we can assume he did want to live. I mean, if he didn't want to live, like, he wouldn't be begging his wife not to have Sir John do the surgery. But alas, he didn't live, and, you know, it wasn't really Sir John's fault either. Onto our regular characters, starting off with Lady Cicely O'Callaghan, who was a good character. I thought she was depicted well on the page. I mean, like Alan, there's a little bit of, you know, Miss Marple in her. Not a lot, but just in the way she has this cool but forceful way about her. I mean, she's a lot more gutsy, I would say. She is willing to go behind Alan's back to investigate her husband's death if she needs to, and she takes matters into her own hands. You know, she's not one to play around, and I think she's a very interesting character. She's not really a suspect. I mean, I suppose she is, but she's never treated as one, nor is the reader ever led to believe like she did it. But she is the main voice of this idea that the anarchists aren't dangerous. And when she finds all those threats, she immediately dismisses the anarchists as not serious. And this is sort of like the crux of traditional detective fiction. You know, the true dangers to society and the lives of individuals aren't these big, you know, political powerful villains. It's not these people who have a lot of control over sort of like the society. The true dangers are the individuals who can destroy the lives of one person or many people. It's the tearing down of intimate relationships and the destruction of intimate lives and someone's personal life that matters. And we don't get this a lot of Marsh. I mean, she is using the communists and the drug barons as her villains, and even in this book, that is sort of the case. I mean, the big villain is this person who seeks to influence society at large. You know, in this book and many others, Marsh sort of pushes back against her contemporaries by saying, no, it is these big villains who are the problem. And again, not that she doesn't have those other villains either, but, you know, and Lady O'Callaghan serves as sort of a counter voice to the point Marsh is making. And she treats Lady O'Callaghan with respect, and Cicely is proven right that her husband was murdered, and he was murdered not by the anarchists, but she's wrong on who. You know, Marsh is making a statement that, yes, there is some truth to what her contemporaries are doing, but they're missing the large. Ruth O'Callaghan, our victim's sister, was a fantastic character. She was so much fun. She's like your wacky aunt who is always causing problems, but isn't like a bad sort. You know, I disagree with the general consensus in the book that she was a literal lunatic. I did not get that vibe from her, but I loved her as a character. She was good comic relief. And what I mean by that isn't like she wasn't there solely to be the comic relief. You know, she played a part in the plot as well. Her pushing the Flavita vaults is just so over the top. I mean, her brother does take at least one of them, so she does have some control over him despite what he says. And when Sir Derek is desperate and in a lot of pain, he reaches out for those Flavita vaults, so he does trust Ruth despite what the narrative would have you believe. And Ruth sort of, you know, she's this character who like frets around a lot, trying to find out information. She goes to see Alan to try to convince him her brother wasn't murdered. She's actually there when Alan gets the phone call that he was. And it turns out she suspected like she had accidentally killed him and was going to kill herself should that be proved. I liked her relationship also with Harold Sage. It was a lot of fun there, just a lot of like dithering around, and then like, I don't know if I really know him or not. Anna Massey plays Ruth in the adaptation, and she was fantastic, so I wanted to shout her out here. I mean, Anna Massey is an actress. She's been in like everything quintessentially British, including, you know, all the usual murder mystery series. Like, she made the rounds there. Ruth is treated like a suspect, even though she's not in the operating theater. She's really like the only one that's truly a suspect who wasn't in the theater. Although, again, it never really felt like she was in true contention to be the killer. Like, if you were to make a list of in the order you think they're likely, because she's probably like towards the bottom anyway. I mean, she's not the type of elderly spinster Marsh uses as killers when she uses them. Marsh loves using elderly spinsters who are kind of jerks as her murderers. She uses them a lot. And we have Sir John, who honestly probably wasn't as interesting as I think he could have been. He certainly has his moments, and he is our prime suspect. And he's the prime suspect in a way where it didn't appear too obvious, and we see most of the surgery from his perspective, which would make you think Marsh put a slight clue in those passages in her writing. But, it's just actually a way for her to ignore what Dr. Roberts is doing, which is still very clever. And Sir John is not this aristocrat in the way a lot of more just sort of like more awful male characters in the similar vein tend to be, but she nonetheless mocks his position quite a bit. He's undermined constantly. He's undermined in his arguments with Sir Derek, in his relationship with Jane, by Sister Marigold in his own hospital, and by Inspector Alleyn. Sir John never gets his way, ever. And we're not really meant to be sympathizing with him either. He fails at everything in life except the surgeries. He fails to get Jane to marry him. He fails to convince the police not to investigate Sir Derek's death. I mean, Sir John is probably based on Marsh's own doctor, who helped her with the medical terminology for this book and for the play Exit Sir Derek. I mean, one would hope she had more faith in him than in Sir John, and I'm certain she did. And we have Jane Harden, who I think was a bit of a missed opportunity. I liked her when she was on the page. She was well-drawn character, though one I think was underutilized. Like, Jane Harden is not in the book as much as I think one would assume for how important she is. I actually like that she doesn't marry Sir John in the end. I know people love happy endings that end in marriages or love connections or whatever, but to me, the couple not getting together at the end is a breath of fresh air. It's so cliche when the couple works out, and I thought she was a great character as this like competent nurse and a young woman who does come off as a bit of a goody two shoes at times. I mean, she's never blamed for the affair with Sir Derek. Instead, it's a lot of Sir Derek getting blamed for ruining Jane's life, which I think is a bit unfair. Again, we don't know exactly what happened between them, but Jane's hesitation over the needle was a big turning point for the novel, although it did feel a bit of a red herring. It played well, however, because Marsh is trying to trick the reader into thinking this could have been an accident and that would have just been one incident in a series up to it. And then we have Nurse Banks, who was a lot of fun. And she's pure comic relief. I mean, she's so over the top and a lot of fun. Her open hatred for working and Sir Derek is brought up at every opportunity. Marsh never takes her side and always makes the point there to ding her. I think most people might see Nurse Banks as a red herring, and although Marsh would definitely use her as a murderer, I don't think that's out of the question. I could see like an Agatha Christie not using someone like Nurse Banks as a killer, but Marsh definitely would. And she gets fired for openly celebrating the death of a patient, which to me is just really funny. I know it's sort of dark humor there, but it's meant to be funny, I think, too. Imagine a nurse doing this in real life, and she complains about how seriously everyone takes their medical oaths, which, like, you would think as a communist, she would want their doctors to serve patients over all other things. It's just another little knock there Marsh gives communists slash anarchists in this book. Then we have Dr. Toms, who was a lot of fun. I mean, Dr. Toms to me is someone who's there for a good time. Like, even in the surgery, he's just so frivolous in his conversation. I don't mean to see like he's not serious about the surgery, but, his mind is always elsewhere. He's the one who introduces the play to Sir John. It's like, hey, did you see that play where this doctor has to operate on his best friend he just had a falling out with, and he has to decide if he's going to kill him or not? LOL. It's like, why would you bring this up before the surgery? surgery. And then he later like tries to hide this conversation because he realizes he might have put the idea into Sir John's head. Dr. Toms is the biggest advocate for an autopsy. Dr. Toms was actually my murderer pick the first time I read this novel outside of like the stethoscope stuff for Dr. Roberts, but like he seemed to be that person who would be the murderer, like the clear suspect, but not too obvious, and someone who acts more in line of how like you would a murderer shouldn't act, so that would make them the murderer. Alas, I was wrong, and I also found it funny when Sister Marigold collapses and he just like starts screaming that the hospital is gonna blow up because she knocked into the anesthesia car, and everyone else was like, "No, nothing's gonna happen. What are you doing?" I mean, that moment was really the moment I was sure it was Dr. Tom's. I'm so mad at myself because I knew the first time I read this that stethoscope of Dr. Roberts was going to matter, and I kept thinking it the whole time, and then like right before the murder reveal I changed it to Dr. Tom's. I wish I could go back in time and read this book for the first time again so I could get it right. And Sister Marigold, she was another good character. I wish we saw more of her, but she's not that major of a character, and she's not a nun either. Sister, I believe, is just the title for a matron in a hospital, and she rules with an iron fist. I mean, she is ostensibly second in command after Sir John, but she rules the roost, and her disgust that Sir John doesn't trust the hospital's supply of hyoscine really gets her goat. I do think her fainting at the end during the reenactment is very out of character for her, and we're never given an explanation. Again, I suppose we're supposed to believe she realized what happened, but I don't see why that would cause her to faint. I mean, she's a very stoic person anyway, and it's not like she has any sort of like relationship with Dr. Roberts. I mean, Dr. Roberts is not the regular anesthesiologist at the hospital, he's the substitute, so like I don't think that's gonna like harm the nursing home's reputation or anything. And the final character I'm going to talk about is Harold Sage, who, again, very fun, our wannabe anarchist who can't commit to the bit, and also the inventor of Fulvita Volts. His relationship with Ruth is very interesting because Marge is constantly playing with us about how close they are. They seem to be in lockstep, but then Ruth says, well, she doesn't really know Harold, and that she's trying to stop him from being a communist. And Harold says, well, he doesn't really know Ruth, and he doesn't want to because he thinks it'll be embarrassing for her because he doesn't want to like cause a rift between Ruth and her brother. And he is a chemist, but he's sort of an amateur. It's never mentioned specifically, but I was sort of under the impression he was like a pharmacology student. It's not mentioned, but he did seem very like unsure about himself, and he doesn't even know what's in the Fulvita Volts. Although I suppose he's lying there, but I don't think that's the case, and neither did Alan. And I would be remiss here not to talk about the package for Fulvita Volts, which features a naked gentleman, and we are told it's a gentleman, not an everyman, being electrocuted back to life, which is just such a great image. It's just so ridiculous, but definitely the kind of thing you would see on a package of Fulvita Volts. And that is it for this video. Let me know in the comments what you think about the nursing home murder. And I did not realize this until I was cleaning up and making the video and looking for the different book covers, but some editions of this book are co-authored by Dr. Henry Gillette, and that would be Ngaio Marsh's doctor, who helped her with the medical terminology and helped her plan this book. I did not realize he was a co-author on some of these editions. He is not on mine. But anyway, that's who that is. And he also helped Ngaio Marsh work on Exit Sir Derek the play, but the play never was produced. But they had this idea to like inject ether into this to the auditorium, which was really funny. And then like he was also helping design like medical props that went really wrong. I mean, during one rehearsal, the actor playing Sir John actually cut through the patient's abdomen. It cut through like the fake abdomen into the real abdomen of the actor playing Sir Derek, which was really funny. But anyway, next week I'm again reviewing a novel, and that will be Sparkling Cyanide by Agatha Christie, one of her standalones. It's celebrating its 80th anniversary this year, so stay tuned for that. Until next time, Mystery Files.